Theodore Roosevelt was the 26th President of the United States of America and is generally considered to be one of the greatest presidents in U.S. history, with his term being from 1901 to 1909. He didn't run in the 1908 presidential election, and his Secretary of War, William Howard Taft, became the next president with Roosevelt's support. However, Roosevelt would come to strongly disagree with Taft's policies once Taft was in office, and he decided to run for the presidency once again. The 1912 Republican primaries would see a bitter race between Roosevelt and incumbent President Taft over who would win the nomination. In the end, however, Taft won the Republican nomination, and Roosevelt ran with his own party, being the Bull Moose Party, and the Republican vote would be split during the general election, where Woodrow Resegregation Wilson would win a landslide electoral election. However, he received just over 40% of the popular vote because he's a loser. Changes to make in an alternate timeline to produce a Roosevelt victory in 1912 would be if he won the Republican nomination. Now in the primaries, Roosevelt had almost 300,000 more votes than Taft, however Taft won 100 more delegates. Roosevelt would have needed to have been a bit more conciliatory towards the more conservative faction of the party in order to get the vote, and he would also need to promise to have someone from that faction as his vice president. This would ensure a clear victory against Woodrow Resegregation Wilson. Now that Woodrow Resegregation Wilson has lost the 1912 election, what's Roosevelt's domestic term going to be like? For starters, Roosevelt's domestic policies will include things like ending child labor, Federal Trade Commission acts, enacting his new nationalism, and continuing desegregation policies. Things avoided are, of course, the resurgence of the Klan and Wilson's terrible anti-civil rights policy. Also domestically, the U.S. will continue to modernize its military forces. Furthermore, Roosevelt wanted to end things like lobbying and have all lobbyists have to register themselves and have limited campaign contributions. Basically, he wanted elections to be a lot more fair and more towards ordinary people so that party bosses didn't really control everything. Roosevelt's pre-World War I foreign policy will start with the Second Balkan War. Roosevelt would take a leading role in negotiating peace between the belligerents, which could witness Bulgaria not losing near as much territory. Without a humiliated Bulgaria, the country may not seek to join the Central Powers in World War I, but more on that later. Elsewhere, Theodore Roosevelt will follow his big stick ideology and gunboat diplomacy to get in, do what needs to be done, and get out fast. When World War I kicks off in 1914, the United States isn't going to immediately join the war. However, President Roosevelt will definitely be strongly pro-Entente in sending armaments as well as American volunteers to go to Europe to fight against the Germans. The volunteer army in this timeline will consist of 4 battalions with officers including Seth Bullock, Frederick Russell Burnham, James Rudolph Garfield, John M. Parker, and Henry L. Stimson, in addition to several other officers, and there would be an entire brigade of African-American soldiers to be led by the newly promoted General Charles Young. In 1915, the sinking of the Lusitania sees Roosevelt bully Congress into getting the U.S. to join the war. There will definitely be a different World War I with American troops arriving in Europe in December of 1915, but first the Atlantic will need to be cleared of U-boats, and the American and British navies will go to great efforts to sink as many German subs as possible in the Atlantic so U.S. troops can be shipped to Britain and France as soon as they can be there. Germany will also see the opportunity to try to sink troop ships and potentially in forming an alliance with Mexico later in the war. With the Americans arriving in late 1915 and many more in early 1916, the Western Front is going to have some major changes as well. To start, the Americans will be facing the same early gas attacks, and the Americans will suffer heavy casualties in the trenches alongside the British and French. However, with these masses of American troops, 1916 will also see pivotal battles like Verdun tip more to the Entente's favor, and the Somme would also witness more Entente gains, with American artillery also bombarding German positions, so Entente casualties could maybe be considerably less. The Eastern Front's impact of having American troops on the Western Front in 1916 would see a potentially way more overstretched Central Power supply line. There are also likely less German units on the Eastern Front as they are diverted to replenish the Western Front and meet the American numbers. Furthermore, the Brusilov offensive may be more successful in forcing Austria-Hungary to drop out of the war in September of 1916, which is a huge change that I'll elaborate on more later. On the Italian front, American troops will also be arriving, and the pure incompetence of Italian Chief of Staff Luigi Cadorna will see no initial changes to the campaigns as he launches more failed Isonzo River battles that end in nothing but more corpses. However, in this timeline, the result would probably see President Roosevelt himself demanding the immediate termination of Cadorna's command no later than spring of 1916. You see, Roosevelt was a war hawk, but he had also seen combat in the Spanish-American War and actually cared about the lives of the American soldiers. He also recognized that pure idiocy of commanders who needed to be relieved and would apply as much pressure on Italy that he could to the point of threatening to remove the American expedition from the front so that Italy gives in and replaces Cadorna with a far more skilled Armando Diaz, who actually knows how to fight World War I without massive pointless casualties. This will also put Italy in a better position for the rest of the war, as there will be no disaster at Caporetto. Looking at the Salonika front, remember back when I said that Roosevelt would try to mend fences in the Balkans so Bulgaria doesn't lose near as much land? Well, here's where it's going to matter. The US had joined the war in this alternate timeline months before Bulgaria would join the war in our timeline. And in this timeline, the Central Powers are still going to offer Bulgaria land in Serbia, however it won't be as much as they lost less land in the Second Balkan War, and at the same time, President Roosevelt will offer the Tsar of Bulgaria land in the Ottoman Empire in 1915 as the Entente is engulfed at Gallipoli. It's possible that Bulgaria might actually join the Entente in this timeline because of Roosevelt, or they would at least stay neutral. But for this scenario, let's go with the idea that Bulgaria joins the Entente for gains against the Ottomans, and in this alternate Gallipoli campaign, it will now see Bulgaria launch an invasion of the Ottoman Empire that relieves Entente forces at Gallipoli, and Constantinople falls in early 1916. This will have drastic changes to the Middle East and the post-war era, which I will talk about later. But one thing is for sure, the Ottoman Empire has surrendered in 1916, and although the Entente will have occupation forces throughout the former empire, a lot more troops from the Mesopotamia campaign and Suez front are now able to participate in other campaigns in late 1916, such as on the Eastern Front, Salonika, Italy, or the Western Front. Something else to note is that the Ottoman Empire has surrendered without the Arab Revolt, which again will have drastic changes that I'll discuss later on. Regarding Serbia, the second invasion of Serbia by the Central Powers is also going to go a lot worse now because there is no Bulgaria to invade Serbia from the east in October of 1915, and the invasion isn't gonna only take Germany and Austria-Hungary a month to occupy most of the country, so that's something that also is worth mentioning. Furthermore, the Germans will have another country to be bogged down in for the beginning of 1916 as America arrives in full force. Additionally, the Allied Army of the Orient would be supporting Serbia in 1916. The 1916 American presidential election will see Roosevelt run for a fourth term to defeat the Central Powers and likely faces William Jennings Bryan on the Democrat ticket. Bryan will advocate for an immediate end to the war and peace, giving America's high casualties. As the war is unpopular due to American involvement being due to the sinking of the Lusitania, both the Entente and Central Powers will watch the election closely. Germany will see an opportunity with Mexico in opening a new front against the United States on its southern borders, as the American army is in Europe. With the sending of the Zimmerman telegram, Roosevelt's victory will be assured, and there's no chance Mexico is going to join the war, because, well, that was just such a dumb idea. Lots of major changes to the war have already happened, and the end of the war in early 1917 is pretty much a guarantee. With both Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire out of the war, America is fully mobilized, there's a lack of a Russian Revolution, and the full force of the Entente is pointing at Germany, which is the last Central Power, and they will surrender around February 1917. Now comes the armistice, many treaties, and post-war conflicts. President Roosevelt will also have some of his own ideas on how to run things in the post-war world, which is very different from Wilson's views, so let's start things off by country. Starting with Germany, since the war ended in 1917, a lot of destruction in Europe, which had occurred in our timeline in 1917 and 1918, hasn't happened. That being said, things like Verdun and 1916 still did, so Germany is going to be punished by the Entente anyway. Now, there are a couple of different ways that Germany can be punished that would lead to different sub-timelines, such as whether or not the Entente lets the Kaiser remain in power, and how much land is taken from the German Empire. However, Germany has not had to deal with the German Revolution, and the country hasn't starved as much with 2 fewer years of being blockaded, so things in Germany are going to look slightly better. Additionally, Belgium and France will not be invading Germany in the interwar era, so that will not be a major grievance that the Germans will have. Austria-Hungary will of course be divided between different countries like Austria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Yugoslavia, and Galicia. Now you might be asking, why Galicia? Shouldn't that territory go to Ukraine or Poland? Actually, no, since Russia never signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in this alternate timeline, the Russian government has not given up Poland, Ukraine, Finland, Belarus, or the Baltic states. Additionally, Woodrow Wilson doesn't have his 14 points to demand independence for many states. Speaking of Russia, since the Brusilov offensive has knocked Austria-Hungary out of the war at the end of 1916, any victory is seen as a fantastic win for Russia compared to how bad they did in 1914 and 1915. However, that doesn't mean things aren't going to be perfect for the Russians. Germany still kicked Russia's butt in this alternate 1916 on the Eastern Front, even if Austria-Hungary was defeated early on. This means that Russia will face many rebellions and independence movements in areas like Poland and the Baltic states. However, there is no Bolshevik Revolution or Russian Civil War. However, I personally don't see the Tsar's reign surviving past the war, and a provisional government will still be established. Eastern Europe is gonna get messy like in our timeline, except considerably less. Poland is gonna be rebelling like crazy. Like I said before, Poland and the Baltic states want their independence, and will make that very clear to the weakened Russian state. It's possible that Poland is granted independence by the Russian Empire under the Entente's pressure, while the Russian army is completely exhausted and just wants to be done with the fighting. At the same time, Hungary won't lose a lot of land to Romania, and the corpse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire is still plundered. However, things for Eastern Europe are going to be pretty unclear in this timeline, as they kind of were in our timeline. Regarding Italy, I think it's pretty safe to say that fascism isn't going to take hold of the country, because although many of Italy's territorial war goals, such as land in Croatia, are not fulfilled, the Italian population hasn't been wasted by Cadorna on a more disastrous Isonzo River offensives, and things are going to look a bit better for the country. Turning to the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire is dissolved pretty much right when it surrendered after the fall of Constantinople to Bulgarian and Entente forces. Bulgaria takes Ottoman land in Europe, and there is an occupation of Turkey from 1916 to 1917 until the war ends. That's because the Turkish War of Independence will begin shortly after, with the entire Ottoman army that hasn't been used in 2 more years of war in the Middle East. With that, I could see the Turks winning this war, but they are not gonna get the Dardanelles in an alternate Turkish state, because Bulgaria won't let that happen. Another major factor is that there has been no Arab revolt, which means that the British and French aren't going to have near as good relations with the Hashemites and Arab world in general when the time for colonizations comes around. Although they are liberators for the Ottoman Empire, things may actually turn out worse than in our timeline in terms of rebellions in the Middle East, especially for the French in Syria. On the idea of the League of Nations, Roosevelt was an early supporter of the modern view that there needed to be a global order in some way. In his Nobel Prize address of 1910, he said that it would be a masterstroke if the great powers, honestly bent on world peace, would form a League of Peace, not only to keep the peace among themselves, but to prevent, by force if necessary, it being broken by others. So with that, I'd say some kind of international body is formed after the war under Roosevelt. However, it wouldn't be as dumb as the League of Nations, and it would be something that actually has teeth to it. Conditions for World War II, for the most part, are heavily avoided, as Germany isn't going to have nearly as many grievances, extremist ideologies like Bolshevism and fascism don't exist, and the Germans had an unconditional surrender, so there can't really be a stab-in-the-back type myth. However, the Empire of Japan is still a thing, which might spark some kind of Pacific War later on. Something else to note is that Theodore Roosevelt is going to live longer. In our timeline, since Roosevelt lost the split 1912 election, he went on an expedition to South America, from which he would suffer health complications later on and eventually cause his death at the age of 60 in 1919. In this alternate timeline, Roosevelt is president and doesn't go on his expedition, so he will therefore live past 1919. That doesn't mean he's going to run for a 5th term, but it means that Theodore Roosevelt will have significant influence in American politics for the coming decades in the 20s and 30s. Another thing to mention is that after President Roosevelt had essentially 4 terms, there would be an amendment to limit presidential term limits to just 2 terms. With that, the 1920 U.S. presidential election sees Roosevelt support his friend and American Expeditionary Force commander General Leonard Wood to win the Republican nomination and go up against an unknown Democrat. The results of this alternate 1920 election and how things go in the post-World War I world is beyond my ability to predict, but I hope you enjoyed it regardless. This has been just one possible scenario about if Theodore Roosevelt had won the 1912 US presidential election, and has been my second Redux video. What do you think would have happened? Are there any other videos you want me to remake? Let me know in the comments, and thank you for watching.